Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Will Tanner. I am the director of the think tank Onward, and I'm delighted to introduce you to the fourth in our Bounce Back Bigger series of events, which are looking at some of the big economic challenges facing the country, facing the government, as we emerge kind of blinking from lockdown, potentially blinking going back into lockdown in some parts of the country, and think seriously about how we recover from this pandemic and how we grow the economy in order to ensure prosperity for all parts of the country. For those who don't know about Onward and who we are and what we're about, we're a relatively new think tank set up 2 years ago to renew the centre-right by coming up with bold and practical new ideas and reaching out to new groups of people. And so this event today is kind of firmly within our bailiwick as an organisation, and something that clearly lots of people in the policy world are starting to get to grips with, because we will be talking today about payback time, how and when to balance the books. We know that over the past 4 to 5 months, the government has shelled out an extraordinary amount of money. This Chancellor has spent more money, increased borrowing than perhaps any Chancellor before him. The OBR July statement talks about the UK being on course to record the largest decline in annual GDP in 300 years, with total managed expenditure likely to reach $1 trillion this year, and the OBR predicting a structural fiscal damage of between 2.4 and 4.7% of GDP. So there is an enormous black hole developing in our public finances. There are very good reasons why we might have spent that money and be continuing to spend that money, but there is a serious question about when and how we start to pay it back in order to ensure that the country remains fiscally sound and that we can continue to service our needs in terms of public spending. So that's the kind of context in terms of spending. In terms of process, over the next few months, some of these questions are going to come to a head. The Chancellor has a spending review coming up. He's sent letters to all departments asking them to find savings within their financial envelopes as departments, while being clear that we will not be returning to a period of austerity. And he also has a number of big reviews ongoing, not least into capital gains tax and business rates ahead of that fiscal event. So there are some big choices looming, and I hope that we can use today's session to get into some of those choices and to really understand some of the big questions facing the government on the public finances. We have a stellar group of speakers here today. They've been kind of advertised before the session. I'm sure you're familiar with them, but Paul Johnson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the go-to oracle on the public finances and the kind of state of the public finances. I'm going to come to Paul first. Secondly, I'm going to turn to Tim Pitt, someone I worked with in government, a former special advisor to, I think, 3 Chancellors of the Exchequer. Is that right, Tim? Or is it just 2? Just 2. Philip Hammond and Sajid Javid, and someone who has worked in government in a variety of other roles as well, including in the Cabinet Office and the Ministry of Justice. So someone who comes with a wealth of experience and now a partner at Flint Global. My third speaker, or our third speaker today, is Charlotte Alldritt, another alumni of the Treasury, who now runs a fantastic think tank called the Centre for Progressive Policy, and doing brilliant work there on a kind of range of issues, but in particular, I'd highly recommend their work on kind of the regional kind of impact of the pandemic, especially in some of the impact on different towns and localities around the UK. And then finally, last but not least, I'm going to turn to Bim Afolami, who I think ever since he was even slated to be a potential parliamentary candidate has been called a rising star of the Conservative Party, and who in his PPS roles and also his wider kind of policy advocacy has been at the kind of forefront of coming up with new economic ideas and put a number of ideas to the government on not just fiscal matters, but actually the kind of the broader question of economic growth about a month ago. So someone who is brimming with ideas and trying to make them happen. So we have a fantastic lineup. The way in which the event will work is I'm going to turn to each of our speakers in turn. They'll give 5 minutes of introductory remarks, reflections on the question we've set. And then once we have heard from all of them, I'm going to open up to a question and answer session. And so I'd encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen as people are speaking. If they say something that raises a question in your mind, please type it and put it in there, because I will pick those questions up and pose them back to our speakers during the Q&A. I will try and ensure that I am on mute, and we'll try and ensure that all of our speakers are on mute when they're not speaking, and unmute them when they want to come in, but they can unmute themselves too. And finally, just to reiterate, I will finish at 3:15 just to protect our speakers' diaries and everyone on the call. So without further ado, because I have taken up too much of the time already, I'm going to hand over to Paul Johnson, our first speaker. And if Paul, you could do what you do brilliantly, which is set the scene and then also potentially pose some brilliant questions, that would be great.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Will. I'll try. It's quite hard to set the scene because I don't think any of us got the slightest idea what the scene looks like, at least looking forward. We've got a pretty good idea what it looks like at the moment, which, as you know, is the deepest recession essentially in history, possibly since the Black Death, who knows, and the biggest peacetime deficit in history. Indeed, the biggest deficit in any time outside of just the First and Second World Wars. But my first comment, I suppose, in a sense, is that none of that, in one sense, in the medium term, matters ever so much. It's not what's happening now that matters. I mean, if we have the worst year on record this year, and then in a year or two's time we're back to where we otherwise would have been, or we can look back on this as a bit of a bad dream, and we'll have more debt, which we can live with. But broadly speaking, we could get on with life not so much differently to if this had never happened, with perhaps a little more concern and risk around the state of the public finances because debt was higher. But the trouble is, I don't think anyone seriously believes that that's what's going to happen. As you said, Will, the OBR think that the structural deficit over the long run, or the size of the economy over the long run, is going to be significantly smaller as a result of this period. And the big question, the big unknown, is how much smaller, which will in part relate to how quickly we get a vaccine, how quickly we renormalize, and so on. And most of the projections I've seen suggest that we'll be at least several percentage points smaller as an economy for some years to come. And if we do get second waves and we maintain social distancing for a long period, it could be quite a lot worse than that. I mean, you said we're emerging, blinking from lockdown. It's not obvious we're doing much emerging. I was at Euston Station at 8 o'clock yesterday morning, and it was just empty. I mean, there was nobody there, which indicates a kind of complete failure to move out of lockdown to some extent. So where does that leave us? Well, I think there's two challenges going forward. One is that the economy is going to be smaller than than we thought, and if we've got a smaller economy, we either do less with public services and spend less, or we, in the long run at least, we have to tax some more. The first of those seems to be unlikely. All of the pressure at the moment is for more spending on health and more spending on social care, and probably more spending on things like levelling up and education and so on. So despite what you said about the Chancellor asking for savings in the forthcoming spending review, chancellors always do that. I mean, Gordon Brown even did that and then sort of sprayed money around. The chances of making up the difference, at least in the short to medium run through spending cuts, seems to me be quite small. And indeed, even if the economy does bounce back, I think the pressure on spending is going to be pretty significant. And that then that then leaves either you're just living with increased deficit and debt or more taxes. I think in the short run, we will just live with increased, not just an increased debt, but an increased deficit. And I don't quite know what I mean by the short run. Certainly this year, certainly next. I don't think there's any likelihood or that the Chancellor is going to be raising taxes for this financial year or next financial year. And then you get into the political economy of whether you leave it until after the next election or not. Interest rates are so low that running that deficit for a little while longer is not going to be a huge problem. But we absolutely need a credible path back to something like fiscal sustainability, and that's going to require, at some point over the next 3, 4, 5 years, some pretty hefty tax rises, in my view. I simply find it difficult to see the alternative there. I mean, other things may happen. The economy may grow much more strongly than anyone is anticipating. I mean, let's hope that that is what happens, and that's clearly the best way out of this. But that's that doesn't seem to be the most likely outcome. And then, if you're thinking about taxes, and I'll say this briefly, there's two things to think about. One is, what are the things that you could do to make the tax system better? And there are an awful lot of those things. And most of those things which make the tax system better also allow you to raise more revenue, because what you don't want to do is raise revenue in inefficient ways. So, I mean, you mentioned the chance of looking at capital gains tax. Well, the key thing about capital gains tax is if that doesn't work properly, then it makes it more difficult to raise income tax effectively, because more people can then avoid income tax by turning income into capital gains. Certainly something that happens among, if you're a company owner, manager, or self-employed, or in some parts of private equity, that is something that's relatively straightforward to do. So you need to sort out capital gains tax to make raising revenue elsewhere more effective. I don't think we'll ever raise vast amounts of money from capital gains tax itself, but we can think about that as a way of raising money elsewhere. I think that's true of all sorts of other aspects of the tax system. People have talked about increasing wealth taxes. There are some aspects of wealth that we need to tax correctly. Housing through a council tax, which is not regressive as it is at the moment, might allow you to raise some more money if you decided to do that. One-off wealth taxes make no difference to an ongoing deficit. Ongoing wealth taxes have never really been made to work effectively anywhere in terms of large amounts of money raised. And I'm afraid my conclusion is a really boring one, which is, if you want serious additional money through the tax system, then we should do what every other country does, which raises serious additional money from the tax system, and most of our European partners do. And they do it through taxes on income and consumption, just like we do at the moment. And actually, I'm afraid the bad news is that they nearly all do it through higher taxes on people on average types of earnings. And I know that's an unwelcome and boring conclusion. But I've not seen, I mean, there isn't any country in the world that does it any other way. And there are, I'm afraid, reasons for that. So that's a boring answer. But that is not to say that we don't need radical tax reform. And we do need radical tax reform across the corporate sector, the wealth, housing, savings, all of those things. And you can shift things a bit, and you can make it a lot more equitable than it is at the moment. You're more efficient than it is at the moment. You can reduce avoidance. But in the long run, if you're looking at big numbers, and I think we're looking at big numbers, then you need to look at the big taxes, and that's income tax, national insurance, and VAT.
Paul, thank you very much for that. That's a brilliant introduction, and actually leads probably very well onto our second speaker, Tim Pitt, who has written extensively on kind of Tories and tax rises in particular, I guess, but we'll have broader views as well. Over to you, Tim.
Yeah, thanks, Will. Yeah, writing about tax rises if you're a Tory is not a way to make yourself popular. Thanks for that. I want to cover 3 points briefly. I want to talk a bit about the extent of the fiscal consolidation we might need, a bit around the timing of when you might start to implement it, and then finally touching on the nature of what it might look like, building on what Paul has just said. So first, on the extent of the consolidation, there's no doubt that the debate on fiscal policy has moved on significantly since 2010. Even before the crisis, persistently low interest rates meant people were getting much more comfortable with higher levels of borrowing. And then when the crisis hit, there was pretty much unanimity across the political spectrum and amongst economists that the Treasury should throw the kitchen sink at the economy, and that the last thing we need to worry about is the public finances, and that was obviously the right thing to do. But I do think there is a real risk that we get confused between being comfortable with really quite extraordinary levels of borrowing in the short term with a general acceptance that low interest rates mean we never have to worry about deficits again. Now, we're all beginning to talk about how we're going to pay for the pandemic. But for me, the crisis is really only exacerbating a problem that we were already going to have to face up to, which is the long-term picture for the public finances over the coming years and decades as we deal with the pressures from things like aging and rising healthcare costs. And the challenge there is pretty extreme. So even before the crisis, the OBR's long-term projections had debt to GDP going to around 300% in the next kind of half century. The latest projections, and as Paul says, it's very difficult to with any certainty to work out what the pandemic impact will be, but had those levels going to 400%. That is levels we've never seen in this country. They're completely unsustainable. And so I think we need to get away from this idea that low interest rates mean we don't ever have to worry about borrowing, because really high levels of public debt are here to stay. And if you think that isn't a problem, you've got to think not just that interest rates are going to stay low for a few years or even a decade or two. You've basically got to think that interest rates are going to be permanently very low. And I think that seems to me incredibly risky and irresponsible. So, now, of course, I'm not suggesting for a moment that that's going to be fixed in one parliament, but I do think we need to start in the right place. And I think for me, that means getting debt, once the economy has recovered, on a clear downward path. And as Paul said, very difficult to know exactly what that might mean in terms of a fiscal consolidation. But on the OBR's central scenario, you're probably looking over the course of this parliament of a consolidation of around 2 or 3% of GDP. The second point then is right, well, what is the timing of your consolidation going to be? And here I think there's tension between the politics and the economics. From an economic perspective, I think you want to err on the side of caution. You want to remove fiscal support too slowly rather than too quickly. But the reality is, if you look at the fiscal consolidations carried out by Tory chancellors, particularly where they've had to raise tax, they've done it early in Parliament. So Howe in 81, Lamont and Clark did it in 93, George Osborne raised VAT in 2010, all well ahead of the next general election. And often in the face of significant criticisms from economists that it was the wrong time in the economic cycle to consolidate. This time, when the right moment from an economic perspective to start consolidating, that's going to depend on how quick the recovery is. But what I would say is that even though I think there will need to be a significant consolidation, I also would challenge the idea that all the political logic says the Tories need to do this immediately and as soon as reasonably possible to get it out of the way well in advance of the next election for two reasons. First of all, because what would be the most damaging to the Tories' electoral prospects would be to consolidate too early and choke off the recovery. And second, because while obviously you don't want to be whacking 5p on income tax on your pre-election giveaway budget, I think there are some tax rises you can raise quite close to elections that the electorate bluntly wouldn't care about or might even support. Corporation tax, and I think very few voters would care if we put corporation tax up by a couple of p the year before an election. Similarly, taxes on the highest earners are in fact relatively popular measures. So I know the Treasury are going to be telling the Chancellor to try and lock in his savings and revenue raises this autumn, and at least announcing them, even if they don't kick in for a while. But I really don't think it all needs to be done straight away. Which brings me on to then the final point I want to make, which is on the nature of the consolidation. Post 2010, it was all about spending cuts. That's clearly not going to be the case this time, as Paul has said. Prime Minister and Chancellor have been pretty clear about that. Tax rises are going to have to do more of the heavy lifting, and as Paul said, it's right that if the pressure, if anything, is upwards, particularly on areas like the NHS and care. But I don't think that means there's going to be no spending restraint at all. On welfare, for example, reform of the triple lock and the winter fuel allowance could both deliver savings. On day-to-day departmental spending, we clearly aren't going to see the big cuts we saw post-2010. How quickly spending rises will make a big difference to the fiscal numbers. So whether you think it can rise just in real terms or in line with GDP, that makes a big difference to your overall fiscal numbers. And then on capital spending, when I was at the Treasury, I was a big defender of the capital budget, but it really is very generous now by historic standards, and particularly given the last time it was this high was in the 1970s, when the government owned all the utilities, so it was having to fund their capital plans as well, which are obviously now done by the private sector. So, I think the government's threshold of 3% of GDP for public sector investment, it's a pretty arbitrary target. The OBR doesn't really think the government's going to be able to spend all that money anyway. So I think you could deliver some savings on capital. But Paul is right, the tax rises are going to have to do the heavy lifting, and that is, for a Tory Chancellor, that is going to be the politically hardest bit for him. Over the last few years, the Tories have basically become seemingly completely allergic to any type of tax rise whatsoever, whereas traditionally they have. If you look at Geoffrey Howe, you look at Ken Clarke, chancellors who've been willing to raise tax. So I'll finish by making one comment on tax. So, and for me, I think given the fact that the chancellor is going to have to raise tax, I think he should make it a clear goal of his tax rises to reduce inequality. Income and wealth inequality in this country are too high. They have been undermining the faith in our political and economic system, and they hold back social mobility. If you really care about spreading opportunity, you can't just level up. You also need to look at what's going on at the top. And so I do think that means looking at things like pensions tax relief. I think the whole question of how we tax wealth needs to be in there. That doesn't mean that everything can be paid for by the top 1%. As Paul said, the reality is the vast majority of people are going to have to contribute something given the long-term challenges. But I do think we should be asking those at the top to do the heavy lifting. And if one good thing can come out of the crisis, then I think it's an acknowledgement from the Tory party that we do need to care about inequality and that we need to take action to reduce it.
Tim, thank you very much. That was extremely comprehensive, and there was lots in there that I'd like to get into, not just the question of kind of sequencing and timetables, but also the kind of the balance between certain types of spending and restraint and different types of taxes as well. Charlotte, I was going to come to you next, and I should have said at the beginning that you're going to need to jump off slightly early, which is totally fine. But so Charlotte, over to you.
Thanks, Will. So I'm just building on what Tim and Paul have said. Obviously short-term borrowing is necessary, and we think that support should be continuing in a targeted and preventative fashion. And I'll talk more about what I mean around prevention as a substance of my remarks today. Agree with Tim, over the medium to longer term, we were going to need to manage down our public sector net debt. But as Paul highlighted, timeframes are uncertain, and I think they're going to be influenced in part by the pandemic, by the fallout of Brexit, and interest rates inevitably. But what I think is clear is that we're going to have to view debt as generational. And if we view debt as generational, we need to think about generational returns to how we spend and what we invest in now. Fiscal policy is obviously not just about tax rates, but also about what and how government spends. So just to give an example, a Sure Start evaluation by Paul's outfit, the IFS, on the effect of child health from children's centres saw no significant impact at 5 years, but significant impact at 10, and more so again at 11 years. And so I think this just goes to show that when we're thinking about the cost and benefits, we do need to look long term, and that should be informing how we shape policy now. The other thing that evaluation showed was the reduction in hospitalisations of children alone as a result of their attendance at Sure Start centres recouped 6% of the programme budget. And again, I think we need to look at what investment we can prioritise now that can essentially pay for itself or recoup that investment down the line. And so building on that, I think sort of some principles we need to set out for how we prioritise spending today. I think it should focus on 3 things as long-term drivers of productivity and growth. The first is around skills, and particularly about how we avoid unemployment. And I think the Chancellor's done an awful lot, but I think on this we've heard relatively little from him. How are we retraining or upskilling people who are in zombie jobs so that they don't just fall off the proverbial cliff in October and can be getting back into the labour market and participating in growing our economy? Second point is around employment support. And I think the DWP have committed to doubling the number of employment support workers, which is great. But I think that we need to think about the wider role that they play in our communities, and actually potentially brokering a function not just with the labour market, but actually with training providers, where we have a real information gap at the moment. For example, if you don't know necessarily what is the right course at which institution, that will mean I can have the greatest chance of finding a good job locally. And I think that's where we need to address some data deficits. And data is obviously a big point of emphasis amongst the current government, which I'm very supportive of. And then finally, in terms of prioritisation, mental and public health. And yesterday I saw for the first time the NHS anti-obesity get off your sofa advert, and quite staggering actually, the sort of level of intervention, and others have remarked on that, particularly from a kind of no nanny state Prime Minister. But I think it's that kind of public health drive, as well as thinking about how we invest in community mental health services, that will get people into the labour market as those opportunities start to come back online. And a King's Fund, a slightly outdated research report now, but in 2007 it showed that poor mental health costs the UK economy 26 billion per year. So we need to think about how we prioritise spending now, because it will matter the extent and pace at which we can reduce our net debt in the future. Skills, employment support, mental and public health. And then finally, just a few other ideas for how we think about economic returns and investment in social infrastructure as a driver of inclusive growth. Others have said that there's no appetite to do the 2010 salami-style slicing approach to spending cuts. But let's flip that logic and think, how does this investment increase productivity? How does this investment enhance individual and community resilience? How does it drive inclusive growth of the short, medium and longer term? And Tim, to your point around capital investment, I argue, what impact can shiny new hospitals play apart from the counterbalancing public accounting role they play with a nice little asset on public books? We've got to consider how we account for capital, and CPP is doing more of this ahead of the SR. Other thoughts in there, I think we haven't mentioned digital services tax yet. That was introduced from April this year, and I think that's, even though it's only going to raise £500 million by 2024 or thereabouts, I think we've got to see if this is a workable revenue source. Is there scope to ramp this up, because the high street is being crushed while Amazon marches on. And I'd also be in support of a land value based tax, and really nice to hear Tim talk about pushing the Tories to get the top to do the heavy lifting. So I think there's a great scope for cross-party consensus, but we've got to think about the principles that not only shape how we tax, who we tax, but how we spend as well.
Charlotte, thank you very much. And before I go to Bim, I should just say that we have had a few questions in the Q&A, but please do carry on adding them in, and I will come to them as we finish the introductory remarks from our speakers. So Bim Afolami, if you want to give your thoughts and finish the panelists' introductions, and then we'll move on to Q&A.
Great, so I'm trying to be a little less gloomy, in particular less gloomy than Tim, though that wouldn't be difficult. He's very gloomy. I think that, no, look, in all seriousness, obviously the fiscal challenge is very great. I think that point's been made very, very starkly and accurately. But what all of the longer term predictions, or rather sort of trend forecasts, prediction is probably a bit too strong, suggest is that we are stuck with a structurally quite low level of growth, not just in this country, by the way, but you see it across different Western countries. And I would like to actually challenge that that consensus that you find amongst economists, and you find it across most developed economies, which is this acceptance of structurally low levels of growth. We need a serious pro-growth agenda. I was very taken by what Charlotte was saying, for example, about skills. Now, let's not divert and spend the whole time talking about skills, but we all know that skills is a part of it. We know infrastructure is a part of it. We know dealing with the new changing nature of the economy is part of it. If we can really focus and seize a serious pro-growth agenda, raise our long-term structural growth rate away from sort of 1.5 to 2% up to a more 3% level, a lot of the fiscal challenges in the medium long term become more manageable. I don't want to now say that that fixes everything, but I do think it makes a significant difference to the overall envelope and how you tax. So I think that's something we've got to think about. I mean, the work that I did in this report I called Unlock Britain came out with some ideas on this. There'll be lots of others, but I think a serious growth agenda we need to talk about. And some of that will have cross-party consensus in areas of skills, for example. Some of it may be more politically contentious, depending on whether people see themselves on the left or right. But the fundamentals are, unless we can raise our growth rate, we are not going to get out of this problem. We'll still be talking about, having very gloomy conversations for the next few decades. The second thing I'd say just about sovereign debt more generally is that the world has basically had to do the same thing to a greater or lesser degree in this crisis. And why that's relevant is that sovereign debt is a relative thing. If I'm a bond investor, if I'm buying debt, I will have to buy a certain percentage depending on my mandate from countries like Britain, Germany, France. I might buy a bit from countries like, I don't know, Italy, Spain, and I might buy a bit from countries that are, I don't know, more third world countries, for example, and I allocate that. Fundamentally, if all of the countries who are similar to us are doing the same thing, it does reduce the sensitivity, at least in the short term, of having higher than we are comfortable with debt levels, effectively because we are all moving up that debt threshold at the same time. I think it was this economist, I think it was Ken Rogoff, and I'm sure Paul will correct me if this is wrong, who wrote a very famous paper several years ago, which basically said once you went above about 85 or 90% GDP, you were damned to eternal damnation on debt, and actually it didn't happen. I'm not saying they're not highly thoughtful and knowledgeable economists, it's just that the context changed. And when the context changes, what you think of as an acceptable level of debt also changes. So that's not to say it's not risky to carry very high levels of debt, but if everybody is carrying very high levels of debt at the same time, that changes the context in which you make those decisions. I also wanted to say something a little bit about how the government should support the economy. So notwithstanding the growth measures, and I think we need to do much more on infrastructure, and I'll come to private financing of infrastructure in a second. Skills is very important. There are various tax incentives which we can use, and there are also areas where, yes, we could probably tax a bit more. So for example, around corporation tax, I think there is a question as to whether driving that lower really has a huge benefit in attracting companies to this country, more say than, I don't know, improving the transport network, for example. So there are things we can do, but my sense is we need to move away, especially for our SME sector, of a very heavily debt-based model of growth. And we need to recapitalize that sector, partly because the amount of debt that corporates, whether large or small, have taken on in the wake of this crisis is huge, but also because it's fundamentally more sustainable to have more equity funding, and not just for sort of whizzy high-tech businesses, the future Googles and Facebooks, but for ordinary businesses, ordinary family businesses, small, medium-sized businesses, like the one my wife runs, family business, which revenues about £2 million a year. Those companies shouldn't be relying on so much debt. We can change the rules, and I'd be interested in Tim's view from a Treasury perspective around the incentives of how you do that in legislative terms. But I think if we can move to a more equity-based model of growth, that can reduce the debt burden on the corporate sector, but critically, it will also mean that we can actually help those companies grow, because a lot of them having access to that capital can really help them grow and adapt to the many challenges that we're all facing. Just a couple of political points to finish off. I think that the political challenge, and it's always dangerous being a politician actually talking about politics in an analytical way. But the political challenge is, if I completely agree with Tim and with Paul that it is very dangerous for us to tighten too quickly. I also do not believe that we need to have these tax rises at the early beginning of the parliament and we sort of do what Tory chancellors have done in the past. I don't believe that. I think it's very, very dangerous to choke off the recovery at an early stage. And I agree with that. But politically, the question people will be asking after 4 years is, how is the Conservative economic policy different from the Labour Party? That's the question that I know that Conservative MPs are thinking about, and I'm sure the Chancellor is thinking about. What are those dividing lines? What are the areas where the Conservative Party will spend money or not spend money or do things in a certain way? And I think that we need, as a Conservative MP, we need to make sure that we are the people not tightening too quickly and sort of a newfound type of austerity or so-called austerity, but we need to be the people with an exciting pro-growth agenda, trying to get that growth rate up to higher levels than we've seen for a very long time. I think the point around wealth taxes that Tim made, I think it's important to comment on this. Now, I think there are what I like to describe as sort of wealth taxes and wealth taxes. You've got the type of wealth taxes we already have, i.e. taxes on property that we already have. And I think that there are areas, for example, around council tax, where you could easily see that there is space for people in very expensive homes to pay a bit more on council tax. And I think that that would be politically doable. And if we were to do that, that could also raise a lot of money, in particular, for example, social care, because obviously that could go to local councils. Now that could be something that could, if not deal with the social care problem entirely, play a big part in solving it. And I think that's doable. So I think those sorts of taxes we should look at. But I agree with Paul, when you look at other countries in the world where they've had these sort of wealth taxes, they don't tend to work very well. And in countries like France, for example, they've actually removed their wealth tax in the last few years. I think was one of Macron's first things that he did. So it strikes me as odd that we'd be going in that direction that lots of other countries are moving away from. And I don't think that would be a good idea. And the last thing I would say is around capital spending, because I do not believe necessarily the British government needs to be the sole financer of capital spending across the whole area of the economy. We need to incentivize private investment into infrastructure. This is a conversation I'm sure Tim, when he was at the Treasury, had 1,000 times. And it's really important that we do that now, because not only does that provide returns for people who, pension funds and various other things, which, by the way, helps pay for people when they're older, so the government doesn't have to pay it, but also it brings all sorts of other benefits. And critically, the government balance sheet is not paying for absolutely everything. So I think that having some incentive in the system to incentivize private sector investment in capital is also very important.
Thank you very much, Bim. So we've covered a huge amount of ground with those introductory remarks. It feels like there is a pretty firmly established consensus, which, to be honest, I feel like is increasingly true across the kind of political and economic divide, that in the short term, as several of our panelists said, it's okay to borrow more and to potentially see debt rising faster than we would have otherwise liked, both because other countries are doing it too, and because of the extraordinary nature of the event that we're going through. And also there's broad consensus that at some point we will need to get back to a path of fiscal sustainability. So it's good for an event titled how and when to balance the books that we are actually thinking about balancing the books, which is positive. But we also got into some serious questions about how we can tax better, to use Paul's phrase, how we can spend better, as Charlotte was talking about, with regard to kind of longer term thinking with regard to prevention and some kind of productivity enhancing spending, and then also not just how we can think about government, but also how we grow the economy, to use Bim's focus, and sort of raise the size or increase the size of the pie, such that government falls as a share of it. So there's a huge amount for us to get into. I'm going to try and just turn to our questions that we've had streaming in while people have been speaking. There are several on taxes, and it's interesting, even in the chat we've already had some chat about the Laffer curve and whether or not we should be cutting taxes rather than increasing them. So if I can come first to a kind of political question, which we've kind of started to get into, which is where on the Conservative backbenches does the political support for higher taxes on wealth come from? And I guess I might just expand that question to where on the Conservative backbenches does support for higher taxes full stop come from? How do you build a coalition that can actually deliver some of the increases in taxation that this group has been talking about? If I could come first maybe to Bim, who is on the Conservative benches. He talks to his colleagues every day. Bim, you talked a little bit about it, but where exactly would you start if you were thinking about raising large amounts of money through taxation?
So, repeating the proviso that I think it is too early to be talking about increases in tax, but to the extent that the decision was made that at some point we did need to increase taxes, I think that the key principles I would use are fair, broad-based, and the wealthiest will have to bear most of the burden. And obviously that's integral to the point of being fair. So what does that look like? I repeat, I think that council tax and looking at land value taxes is an area that could be explored. And I think that's true. I think an area that the areas that should definitely be avoided are the ones that would be a disincentive to entrepreneurial activity. So we should steer away from those and try and tax things, if you're trying to tax things that have the least possible impact on people and on companies trying to grow the economy. So they are really the principles. But having said all of that, I think that it will be very, very challenging indeed, because in the real world, if you're raising 500 million here or 500 million there, you can get agreement for those things. They're quite small. If you're talking about things that Paul was talking about, if we're talking about several billion, they obviously become a lot harder. I think that, as I say, I think that looking at online sales tax, which I've heard floated, I don't know how true that is, and the relationship between that, business rates and the high street, in that sort of area, if we can come up with tax reform that can help the high street in some way, I think that would be supportive. One thing I'll just briefly mention is green. We haven't mentioned net zero. And I think personally that things that would be taxing environmentally bad activity to help raise money to steer people into better things, which by the way also help to create jobs, which helps us in all sorts of other ways. I think that's an area of taxes that I think are morally just and practically could get probably more support than some of the other things.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to pose the same question to Charlotte and then Tim and then Paul. We'll just go in the opposite order to how people spoke. So Charlotte, where would you start on tax rises?
Well, yeah, I mean, I mentioned in my remarks and Bim's just said, I think the digital services tax is effectively, I would think of the next few years as a trial. And does it meet the principles that Paul touched on of good taxation, insofar as it being efficient, etc., and not distorting the market? But I think already the online giants are distorting commerce to the extent that we need to rebalance that. And the unfortunate effects of social distancing are compounding those long-term trends. So I think our tax code has to keep up, and we've known that it's sort of lagged behind the realities of how we increasingly live and work. So I think we need to, I'm not suggesting kind of Merley's part 2, don't worry, Paul, but I think we do need to get up to speed and use the moment of now to think about how, when so much of our lives are lived digitally, we can see a fair level of taxation that follows that.
Okay, so fairness is coming through very strongly. Tim, you did touch on this a bit in your remarks, so I'm slightly coming back to you on the same point. But if you could talk a little bit more about the politics of this, and where you think the Chancellor could try and form a coalition of support on the Conservative backbenches in particular, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, and again, I think it comes back to the point about how much revenue you're actually trying to raise and picking your political fights. There's no point in having huge political fights for 500 million quid a year, right? So I think that has to be front and centre. I mean, the kind of obvious big places to go for the Chancellor, which meet the manifesto commitments, assuming you're not going to break the manifesto commitment and raise income tax or raise the next rates. Freezing thresholds on personal tax doesn't raise you a lot in year one, but if you do it for 2 or 3 years, suddenly you're raising quite a lot of money, and that would help to broaden the tax base. And obviously, I mean, that would be a reversal of what the Tories have been doing since 2010, which is trying to take people out of tax, but that is one place. Corporation tax, I think, certainly when I was in the Treasury, there was, we heard from business time and again, there was no need to cut corporation tax to 17%. Obviously, the Chancellor decided, well, Sajid Javid decided to put that in the manifesto. They haven't gone down to 17, they're at 19. I think you could raise corporation tax another couple of pence. That's probably 5 billion a year. I think the big one, the other really big one, is whether you do something on personal tax, and this would be quite progressive, would be on pensions tax relief, and whether it's something you do there around limiting it to basic rate, or or even having a flat rate at 25 or 30%. If you have a flat rate of pensions tax relief at 25% or at the basic rate, you are talking high single figure billions, I think, and potentially, I think, not completely impossible. I think then the final one I would touch on, which is on the top 1% and how much you can actually raise from them. I think there's historic skepticism in the Treasury about actually how much money you can raise from them. They already pay a lot of tax. I think what I've been interested in over the last couple of months, there's some interesting work coming out, which I think the IFS are involved in, and people at Warwick and the LSE, looking actually at, there's a huge differential within the top 1%. So a lot of people within the top 1% are paying very high rates of tax, but a lot of them are paying really not very much. And if you equalise that across within that band and target those who are paying much lower rates because they're getting their income in form of capital gains, again, you can start to talk about serious money, high single figure billions. So those are just a few areas I think politically you might look to.
Thank you, Paul. You're on mute.
Yes, I mean, I think Tim's absolutely right. I mean, it depends what sort of scale of money we're looking at in terms of raising tax. But I mean, one thing to do is, so where have the big tax rises been over the last decade? Well, there's been two big ones, really. One is the increase in VAT back in 2011, and the second one has been a huge increase in tax on pension contributions, actually, particularly for very high earners, and very quietly done, and has raised, I can't remember, 7, 8, 9 billion. I mean, really big change. And possibly you could go further on the pension tax relief thing. I think where hasn't there been any increase in tax? Well, as ever, it's looking at that. So those putting money into pensions have been hit. Those taking money out of pensions haven't at all. I know this won't garner many votes, particularly for Conservatives, but actually charging additional tax on occupational pensions in payments would seem to be both equitable, because that's a group that's not been hit, and because they've never had national insurance contributions paid. I mean, it's extraordinarily generous and intergenerationally unfair. Raised small number of billions. That you can certainly do things with council tax to get more from those in higher properties, but that's a couple of billion. I'd like to do you could probably get a bit more from inheritance tax, but you really do need lawyers to be thinking about that, not economists, because it's all about how you make it happen, as is the point about the differential in the top within the top 1%. Capital gains tax, bringing the tax of the self-employed up towards tax on employees. It's one of the things that pre-COVID the OBR was very worried about, because that's we are losing tax revenue, and people are saying they are self-employed or company owner managers because there are big tax advantages associated with that. Actually, HMRC have put rules in place, that sort of administrative rules in place, to make that a bit more difficult to achieve. But there are fundamental problems with the structure of the tax system in the way that that's done. But but to repeat my sort of earlier point, if we're talking about several percentage of GDP, and I think we might be, that's tens and tens of billions of pounds. You really can only get tens and tens of billions of pounds by doing big things, putting a few p on the main rates of income tax, or on the employer national insurance or employee national insurance contribution, or extending VAT to other things. Now, none of those are at all popular, and you need to do them, gradually and carefully if you're going to bring the population with you. Or you might do it in a roundabout way, and I think this is something probably going to get quite a lot of thought, which is as a some sort of hypothecated tax for social care. I mean, we've heard that suggested. Increasing taxes on the over 40s, I think, was flown. That kite was flown recently, or some kind of hypothecated tax for health. Now, I'm not particularly attracted to those, but it may well be that in this world that they are the best routes to getting public acceptance for higher levels of taxation. And actually, in a sense, that's what happens in a lot of European countries, where they have a much stronger social insurance system. So why do France and Germany, or how do France and Germany and the Netherlands and Italy and so on raise much more in tax than we do? A lot of it is through their social insurance systems, which are effectively hypothecated tax. Now, to an economist, they look quite inefficient, but from a political economy point of view, they seem to work.
Thank you very much, Paul. So I'm going to move on from tax to tax avoidance. Now, Paul, you spoke about taxing better. We've had one question. Our first question was from Alexa Phillips, who asked what kind of reform could address tax avoidance, both by individuals and corporations, and how much could that yield? I wonder if I might, I mean, feel free to say that you don't want to come in on this, but I thought Tim and Paul in particular might have views on the extent to which, I mean, every government I have ever known talks about reducing tax avoidance and generating billions as a result. But I think there are serious questions about the effectiveness of some of those programs, and clearly HMRC has long struggled to keep ahead of some errant behaviour within markets. We're trying to avoid tax. To what extent is that serious as a way of plugging some of this hole, or is that just something we should be doing anyway, but we shouldn't rely upon to fill some of the gap? Tim, can I come to you first?
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk very briefly. I mean, yes, absolutely. Every budget, the Treasury, the Chancellor tasks the Treasury to go and close more loopholes. They duly go off. They've done a pretty good job, I'd say, over the last decade. You look at the tax gap; it has come down significantly, but that isn't transformational amounts of money there. I think. I think the one area, it's not. I wouldn't say it's avoidance, but it's. If you can reform the system to remove some of the kind of loopholes that allow people doing the same thing to pay very differential rates of tax, I think you could potentially raise some significant money. The most obvious one is around essentially people self-incorporating and paying corporation tax or capital gains tax, or paying tax at dividends rate for what is effectively what we would call employment, right? So actually, if you matched up capital gains tax, the rate paid on dividends, income tax, that would go potentially quite a long way to dealing with some of that. And that, of course, is what Nigel Lawson did in 1988, right? So he made capital gains tax and income tax, so there's at the same rate. There's a good solid Tory history there. The Chancellor is looking for someone, and Nigel Lawson much loved on the Tory backbenches. So if he's looking for someone to point to as he whacks up capital gains tax, that might be the way to go.
Paul, want to come in?
Yeah, I agree. I agree with all that. I mean, it's the point. I mean, one of the issues around avoidance, how much, or anti-avoidance things, how much it brings in, is that it's very difficult to know what the counterfactual is. I think if none of the anti-avoidance measures that have been put in place over the last 10 years had been put in place, we probably would be raising a fair bit less, because it's a continual sort of sticking your finger in the dam, as it were, to stop the money flowing out. And I think it's genuinely the case that some of that has made a significant difference. So this is something government needs to keep a continual, an absolutely continual eye on. Tim's absolutely right. I mean, there are bits of the tax system which just say, please avoid me. I mean, just come and avoid some tax, because if you're going to tax people who incorporate less than people who are self-employed, less than people who are employees, well, what a big surprise that the number of incorporations and the number of self-employed has gone up enormously over the last 15 years. I think my favourite thing the Treasury has ever done, actually, it did this in the last budget, when it reduced entrepreneurs relief, which is an absurd sort of giveaway to the mega wealthy of very low tax rates on 10 million of gains, and it replaced it. Well, this sounds great, doesn't it? Entrepreneurs relief, and it replaced it with business asset disposal relief, BAD relief, which is just fantastic. I think it's, whoever did that had a great sense of humour. So maybe the answer is just to kind of rename things you don't like as bad.
I think there's quite a lot of truth in that. Entrepreneurs Relief definitely did get significant support purely as a result of its name. So I would like to move the discussion on a little bit, because we've had a few questions that kind of take us from tax onto spending. And there are two questions in particular that I think get into this. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to take them together. And the first is from Jim Clark, who talks about while we clearly need to balance the books and lower the deficit, the public has become used to high levels of government support in many sectors, with many sectors asking for more at the moment. Is it going to be difficult for the government to pivot messaging from whatever it takes, to use the Chancellor's phrase, to we can't afford it? Like, how do we politically shift that mode of conversation to a public that has become used to there being money available for some of these things? And a similar question, or at least a related question, from an anonymous person tuning in today, which is, will the public consensus against a return to austerity and continued public spending hold if we see some of the unemployment and labour market effects that we're likely to see over the next few months and years, especially, I mean, they mentioned the retail and hospitality sectors in particular. So if people think the economic environment is worsening considerably, do we think that is going to lead to a growing public acceptance for public sector restraint in some way? So two questions: how do you shift from whatever it takes to we can't afford it, and will the public potentially get more on board with that as some of the economic consequences of the recession take hold? Bim, can I come to you first on that?
Yeah, thanks, Will. I think the first question is a very, very good one. I think that what the government needs to do is the government needs to set out very clearly the areas where, well, rather, the principle has to be, if you're supporting a sector, that has to be support that over the medium long term has a chance of almost generating a return. There is absolutely no point throwing good money after bad. And I do think we're going to have to be quite brave about certain sectors, because that really is money down the drain. And what we need to be doing is not propping up sectors where structurally they are in decline for whatever reason, online, all sorts of reasons. Like in any normal functioning market economy, things go in decline or in the ascendancy at any given point. And then focus our efforts on areas where both people and industry and innovation is happening. And that's to say, I repeat, I think that going towards net zero, whether it be in energy, whether it be in home insulation, whether it be in all sorts of other areas, that is somewhere where we know we're going to need more of. And I think we need to support those more. And in relation to the high street, now look, I've got 2 market towns in my constituency, and I deal with this every day. But ultimately, we need to enable the high street to stand on its own 2 feet. The future of the high street cannot just be through government, handout. The high street is going to have to stand on its own 2 feet, and that may mean a change in the nature of it. So I think that's what we have to do. The question on the consensus around public sector pay, I think, is a very good one, and my instinct is it will not continue. I've already had a few people, I wouldn't say this is representative, say things like, I've been keeping my business going all this time. All my workers haven't got a pay rise because we've just about kept everything going. And then I see, public sector pay going up through the roof. Now, I'm not saying they're quite right. I just say that I think that there is a need to remember that ultimately the private sector is what generates the wealth. And we need to make sure we don't get into a position whereby, especially in certain regions of the country where almost public sector pay outstrips private sector pay to such a degree, especially for graduates, that it's impossible to get people to really level up the economy because they're all in the public sector. So I think that we are going to have to think about that.
Thanks very much, Bim. Tim, did you? So you've talked a little bit about this, but how do you do that shift from spending large amounts of money and doing whatever it takes? Like politically, how does the Chancellor approach that question?
I think I would be spending a lot of time thinking about it now. I think you've got to do a lot of pitch rolling, and I think you've got to explain it very, very clearly. And I think you have to put it within the context of an overall plan. And I think what the government on the economic side and fiscal side has done very successfully in the short term is deal with the problem right in front of them, right? And that has consumed all the bandwidth. But as we come out of it and look longer term, I don't at the moment have a sense of what the government's overall economic and fiscal strategy is. And I think putting what your fiscal strategy is in that wider context and explaining, therefore, some of the difficult decisions I think is really important, and actually, taking quite a lot of time to do that and to pitch roll. I think it's a huge challenge for him, and I think it's going to come pretty quickly because, assuming he sticks to the date for the JRS, for the job retention scheme to unwind, he's already seeing some criticism saying that might be too early. If you see a big spike in unemployment, that's just that is going to be the first test of it. So I think he really needs to try and get ahead of it. Over the next month or two, and certainly ahead of the spending review. You really want to contextualise what the spending review is, any difficult decisions in there. And briefly on the public consensus, I think overall, yes, the anti-austerity narrative will hold. As I said at the beginning, I do think there are areas where you could find some savings, and I think Bim is absolutely right on public sector pay. And actually, I didn't think this was in April. I thought there was no chance of that. When you're in the middle of the kind of pandemic, I thought that's going to be very difficult. But if you look at it now, and once unemployment spikes, and if private sector wages are held down, I think that that is an example of somewhere where I think the mood will have changed, and there will be room for savings.
Paul.
Yeah, it's that move from Rishi Sunak as Santa Claus to Rishi Sunak as Scrooge is going to be a really difficult one to pull off, and it will be really painful, and we'll see that it begins to be painful as the job retention scheme is withdrawn. And I have to say, I think it is right that it's being withdrawn over this sort of period. We can't continue to support all jobs forever, which would be the sort of alternative. Ideally, I'd like to see it done in a slightly more targeted way. But when you talk to people at the Treasury and so on, they really do seem to think it's simply not feasible to do it in any more targeted way. Though how true that is very hard to judge. But I do think the initial move is going to be from reducing the initial support rather than to big cuts in spending or big increases in tax. I think that's a little bit down the road. And of course, at least the tax increasing side of that becomes a bit easier if the economy is beginning to grow. I think the difficult bit is the withdrawal of the life support over the next 6 months, and timing that right and getting that right is a staggeringly difficult set of judgments to make. On the I mean, just coming back to this point about public sector pay, it's very odd public sector pay. I mean, it's a similar thing happened in the, in 2008, 2010. Public sector pay raced away ahead of private sector pay over that period, and then it's been pulled back and actually is down at historically low levels at the moment, and now it's going to bounce up during the recession. So it's very counter-cyclical, you kind of annoy everybody because public sector workers got very angry over the last decade. Actually, up to about 2016, it was just kind of catching up with the big increases they'd had in 2008, 2010, and now, of course, you're going to make private sector workers angry because increasing public pay when everything else is going badly. It'd be much better if we had a more rational approach to public sector pay setting more generally, where it was just much more closely related to what was going on in the economy more generally. But rational approaches to public sector pay seem to be quite hard to achieve.
Indeed. Okay, so we've got about 9 minutes left. Unfortunately, Charlotte had to dip away, as I mentioned. So I was going to come on now to some of the subject of Bim's remarks, which was kind of growing the economy. So we've talked about tax, we've talked about tax avoidance, and we've started to talk a little bit about potential areas of spending restraint. But there is a kind of another side to this, which is around how to grow the economy, which is usually a longer term discussion than some of the timescale that we've been talking about for most of this session. So how does the government genuinely try to approach this question of growth? We've had a question from Adam Glinsman saying BIM is correct in emphasising growth as well as tax and as a component of government policy. Does the panel have views on how to develop an industrial strategy around business formation through the tax structure or through targeted funding, for example, the Future Fund? There is a potential positive story that could really emerge from the rebuild after COVID beyond just discussions of tax capture. Is that, I'd be very interested in the extent to which people think that those discussions are right, but they are too long term and they aren't going to have a material effect on this discussion of balancing the books in the kind of short to medium term, or whether or not there are real gains to be had in growing the economy quickly as a result of the or out of the recession that we're in. Tim, could I come to you, then Bim, then Paul, if that's all right?
I mean, I think there's two separate questions, right? One is how quickly can you get the economy back to growing, at the kind of rate it was pre-crisis, and how quickly you can recover. And then there is a separate question, which is which is what BIM focused on, which is how can you boost productivity? How can you get the long run growth rate of the economy up, which will obviously help materially with the fiscal picture. Although, if you look at the OBR's long-term projections, they're already assuming that we get growth back up to 2%, I think, in their fiscal sustainability report. 2% trend growth. Given the last decade, most chancellors would bite your arm off for that. So even getting to that point is difficult. Getting even beyond that to try and help that longer term picture, I think, is even harder. I think the thing I would say on growth is I think there's, and I do worry a bit about this, which is that we confuse the absolutely vital role that public spending has in the short term with thinking that the only way that you boost growth in the long term is through more public spending and just ever more dollops of cash on lots of different projects. Now, absolutely, public spending has a role to play in boosting productivity, in spending money on infrastructure. There's a case for R&D spending. I'm not sure you quite need to go to levels the government is going, but I would prioritise more money in the human capital space, for example, than just in the physical capital space. But overall, I think what we've lost sight of in the last few years is the kind of bigger picture, very boring stuff, which is the UK economy historically. One of its great strengths was its political stability, the certainty it provided to business, the strength of its institutions and its independent regulators. And for a variety of reasons over the last 4 or 5 years, those have been undermined. Brexit has obviously, whichever side of the debate you're on, there's no doubt Brexit has caused a significant amount of uncertainty. There has been a lot of concern in the business community about the threat of a Corbyn government and what that might do. There's been increasing politicisation or sense of politicisation of regulators as well. and a sense that the UK's institutions might not be quite as independent, as strong as they were once. So I think there is a huge amount that the Chancellor can do and the Prime Minister can do by just setting out the important, providing as much certainty as possible, setting out the importance of our institutions, and really, without thinking that the answer to everything is just spending a bit more money here and there. It's that overall macro framework that I currently think is missing from the government's strategy, and I think that is hugely important. For completely understandable reasons, they've had to focus purely on COVID, but I do think that is what needs to come next, and ideally you want to start setting that out ahead of doing a 4-year spending review, 3 or 4 year spending review.
Thank you, Tim. I heartily agree. My kind of pet theory about basically everything is that the problems that we face are largely down to a kind of erosion or degradation of our institutions across a whole manner of different spheres of life. Paul, can I come to you on that as well? Sorry, I was going to go to Bim first and then Paul. Bim.
And Will, your last comment shows why you're a Conservative, quite right. I agree with Tim that you shouldn't forget the boring. I always have the basic principle, which is the people who came before us were just as intelligent, if not more so, faced very similar challenges. And the fact that they identified a lot of these problems, guess what? They're the same ones we have. And we shouldn't forget dealing with those problems, skills, R&D, infrastructure, all the things we know. Those things are still critical for improving our long-term growth rate. A couple of other things. One is, and I touched on this earlier, if we could do something very ambitious, and I've spoken to Jim O'Neill about this and various others about recapitalizing the corporate sector, that could be the sort of thing that could help generate a new wave of SME growth and SME innovation. And I think that's something we should really think about. And by the way, that's not spending. That if that works, the public finances at the very least will be trued up. And if we do it effectively, could almost end up with a sovereign wealth fund type effect. So I think that we should really think about that as not just good for getting us out of the hole, but over the long term, having a much more equity into our corporate sector can make a big difference. The second thing, and it hasn't touched on, is around security. And I think, Will, I remember talking to you about this a couple of years ago, and how economic security is was such an important thing pre-COVID. Now, that's not just a political question, that's an economic question, because if people feel more secure, that affects the decisions they make around spending and investment as an individual and if they set up a business, etc. So thinking of welfare in helping to provide more economic security, maybe income protection insurance on higher earners, various other things we can look at. If we did that, what might that do to people's expectations over the long term, whether they're willing to take risks, whether they're willing to work in the private sector rather than the public sector, etc. So I think that's something that should be thought about. And the third thing, and it's deeply unfashionable for Conservatives to say this these days, but I do think our regulatory structure needs looking at. It is mind-boggling, just the huge growth in rules, laws, quangos, structures that has happened, not just in Britain, but pretty much every single Western country over the last 30 years. Now, a lot of those, by the way, are done for very good political reasons, the environment being one very good example. But we really should look at that, not to reduce the regulations, but make them simpler, easier to understand, and have fewer bodies that implement them, because over the long run, those are the sorts of things in all sorts of areas that can make the difference to things happening more quickly, more easily, and faster. And ultimately, they're the things over the long term that improve your structural growth rate.
Thank you very much, Bim. And Paul, and we're going to have to finish, I'm afraid, after your remarks, Paul.
Very, very briefly, I agree with very much with the other two, and particularly Tim's point about institutional structures and certainty and clear frameworks being really important. It actually relates back to one of the things that Bim said right at the beginning about how we can finance our deficit because everyone else is doing it and it's a relative thing. Actually, if we're doing relatively worse because people are worried about our response to coronavirus, because they're worried about Brexit, maybe they're worried about the breakup of the union, actually in a world where everyone else is trying to raise money, that might be a problem for us. So actually this institutional solidity and certainty and clear frameworks and good policy is absolutely vital to everything that we've been talking about. And there are two, but just to kind of add to that one last point, governments can do quite a lot for growth in the long run. We need getting our education system right, our vocational education and apprenticeships and so on right, getting infrastructure investment right, competition and regulation regimes right, housing right. Government, it's quite dangerous for government to try and up growth next year by a lot, certainly by relying on a big increase in public spending or whatever in order to do it. Yes, to stop things getting worse and to tide the economy over, but governments, in my view, can do more than you imagine in the long run, and very often less than you imagine in the short run.
On that note, then, on perhaps the inability of governments to do too much about growth in the long run, I'm going to have to bring it to a close because we're a couple of minutes over already. But I just want to say thank you really to our 4 panelists, including Charlotte, who's no longer with us, for sparing the time today, and for everyone who's tuned in. These sessions have been a kind of brilliant way for us to just start to have the conversation about some of the big challenges we're facing. And it's clear that the kind of fiscal question is not even, we haven't even begun to be kind of finalising the answers to this question. And I suspect we'll still be debating it in 2-3 years' time because the size of the problem is just so great, and the difficulty of some of these solutions are so vast. But thank you very much, all of you, for tuning in. It does feel like there is a degree of consensus between our panelists about what needs to be done, which is at least optimistic and positive, although I'm not sure any of us underestimate just how politically challenging some of those choices are, and how much politicians will need cover and arguments and evidence in order to potentially deliver some of those difficult changes in order to bring the public finances back to some kind of stability. So I hope we can all, whether you're a speaker on this call or someone tuning in from afar, be part of that conversation in future. And I hope that you'll tune in to future Onward work in order to help make the case for some of these sensible choices. But without further ado, and respecting the kind of diaries of our speakers and our attendees, I'll bring today to a close. We have one more of these sessions as yet unscheduled, but it's going to be on levelling up and looking at just how the government can deliver on its kind of totemic vision of levelling up the country, reducing regional disparity, that we'll be holding either during August or early September. So I hope that you'll tune in for that. But until that point, thank you very much, and I'll see you very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.